Two and a Half Admins, episode 195. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Has Windows 11 really lost market share to Windows 10?
Probably.
Well, this is a piece on the Register, and they talk about some stats that they've got from StatCounter, which I'm always a little bit dubious about, to be honest. But I wouldn't be that surprised if Windows 10 was slightly growing versus Windows 11.
I wouldn't be surprised either. There's an awful lot of people that are buying refurbished PCs and they get whatever operating system comes on it. There absolutely are people who are nuking their Windows 11 off of newly bought PCs and going back to Windows 10. And I think a lot of the reason for that, everybody points at the onerous hardware requirements for Windows 11, but I don't think that's a reason for the market share to actually decline from what it was originally. However, you look at things like, the ads injected into the start menu and just obnoxious annoyances like copy and paste disappearing off the context menu unless you click on more to see them. There's a lot of paper cuts there that genuinely piss people off, and I don't find it difficult to imagine that people are actively avoiding it, even to the level of actually wiping out 11 and going back to 10 in some cases.
I think it's more likely to be static than really changing massively, because anyone who's going to go to Windows 11 has gone to Windows 11, surely. If you've got brand new hardware that needs it, obviously you could run Linux or whatever, but if you're in the Windows world, then if it's too modern, then your only option is 11. And if you've got relatively modern hardware, then if you're going to upgrade, you will have done it by now. So it's people who either just don't want to or can't officially because they've got, 5th, 6th generation i5 or whatever.
Well, I think there are some scenarios that you're not considering. It's really weird for Windows 11 to have had the dominant market share and then to decrease relative to 10. And the most plausible way that I see that happening again is really refurbished PC sales, which are everywhere right now.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you can imagine, for example, and this is all, we're talking straight out of our butts here, but for example, imagine somebody who goes to Walmart and buys the cheapest possible Windows 11 computer, absolutely freaking hates it, gets rid of it, and then buys a refurbished Windows 10 PC for the same amount of money or less off of Amazon. Well, you just went down one Windows 11 and up one Windows 10. Even though you didn't actually change the OS installed on the actual hardware, nobody was using that Windows 11 machine that you bought from Walmart until you bought it. And then you bought it and stopped using it, and now nobody's using it. Nobody was using that refurbished Windows 10 PC since it had gone in for refurbishment until you bought it. And now you bought it and you're using it. So you add that to the people who have gone and wiped out Windows 11 and reinstalled Windows 10, on their own hardware, new or old, when they decide they don't like it badly enough to be willing to get rid of it. And again, I don't have a whole lot of trouble seeing this one. Now, I doubt the market share has changed like massively, but any amount down on a deprecated operating system, well, that's pretty big news.
Yeah, and I think there are some other explanations here as well. The fact that this is the percentage of traffic they saw and not raw numbers might mean that actually the number of computers they saw running Windows 10 and Windows 11 both went up just by different amounts. Depending how they capture this, it might be that people that were using Windows 11 were using two browsers and went to using one browser and don't get counted as two people anymore. Like how much did the Microsoft's changing around Windows Edge browser or whatever mean that, especially when they kept making, if you try to open something from Microsoft Teams, it opens in Edge no matter what browser is actually your default browser in your operating system. And so then you're now two separate computers. And maybe some of that accounted for a bunch of corporate Windows 10 machines getting counted as two machines because people use Firefox or Chrome, but every time they click on a link in stupid Teams, it opens in a stupid Edge browser and things like that.
Maybe.
But also, looking over the same time period, maybe the bigger story is that the Windows 7 percentage has dropped like a full % over that same time span. And that's like a third of the difference between the Windows 10 and Windows 11 into this. How many people are still using Windows 7? And the fact that that's actually trailing off at a whole % over the 1 year time span of the graph.
That's a good point. We could also be seeing Windows 7 users who are giving up and getting new computers, getting computers with Windows 10 instead of Windows 11.
Yeah.
Yeah, because computers are much better than they used to be. Alan, your laptop is an X270, right?
Yeah, X270.
Which is not capable, technically, of running Windows 11, but it is still a very capable machine.
Yeah, I just wish I had a little bit more RAM.
Yeah. But that is a perfectly capable machine for the vast majority of computer users, but it can only officially run Windows 10. And so you've got all of these old machines knocking around that are now relatively cheap. I mean, you can pick up an X270 for less than £100 in the UK, but it's only ever going to run Windows 10 unless you start hacking it, which we've talked about before, which normal people don't do.
Or, you put Ubuntu on it or something.
Yeah, well, exactly, which is, of course, what I would do. But normal people don't. They stick with Windows. And could it be that you've got all these capable machines which are now relatively cheap because they can't run Windows 11, and people are picking them up and using them with Windows 10, which is still supported technically?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing I already said, which is, I personally think a lot of this is going to have to do with refurbished PC purchases. And essentially, You just said the same thing.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, the other thing is also definitely consider the source, statcounter.com. It's like, how many people are using StatCounter on their website anymore?
Quite a few, to be fair. It is a lot of websites have got this code tracking people. But like I said, I'm always a bit dubious of anything that is web-based because you get into like huge networks behind that and stuff. How many, hundreds of machines are actually being counted as one and stuff.
Right. Or the fact that my TV computer pretends to be a Samsung Smart TV so that it'll get the TV version of YouTube instead of the desktop version of YouTube.
I think that is an anomaly, though.
Yes.
I don't think normal people do that, Alan.
Also, the statcounter.com stuff, I'm not sure I believe how low the percentage of Firefox they claim is, and that Opera is as popular as Firefox.
Oh, I believe that.
Like, Firefox has definitely been trending down, but I don't think Firefox only accounts for 3% of internet traffic now.
I think that's probably accurate, actually.
Why has everybody given up on Firefox so much?
That is about 3 shows worth of conversation,
Okay.
Alan, not for today.
Okay.
The short version, Edge is Chromium based now.
Yeah, but even Edge is only accounting for 5% on this statcounter.com stats. I think if you look at stats from a different website, you will see different numbers.
But the bottom line is that these are just sort of educated guesswork, let's just say. But Microsoft actually has the proper stats because you know that Windows is phoning home and telling them. So they must be worried about this, surely. What are they going to do about it?
I think they're just going to say we're Microsoft and the world will have to adjust sooner or later. They can wait it out. What are you going to do? Stop using Windows?
Install GNU/Linux, yeah.
Yeah, stopping using Windows is not necessarily that bad, but if you're talking in a business especially, well, you're not just stopping using Windows, you're stopping using Windows, you're stopping using, Autodesk products, you're stopping using MATLAB, you're stopping using Adobe products, basically you just locked yourself out of the entire software ecosystem that you need to communicate with, peers, customers, upstream alike.
So Microsoft is just banking on people having to buy new machines or run Windows 10 unsupported then?
You may have noticed this is not Microsoft's first near universally hated version of Windows. And it doesn't seem to slow them down a whole lot.
But I don't even think that Windows 11 is particularly hated. Like, yeah, okay, the ads and stuff piss people off, but I think it's much more about the hardware requirements, which you want to play down, Jim.
I do want to play it down because it really doesn't matter except for at the very bottom end of the spectrum. If you're buying a new machine, it's going to be Windows 11 capable.
Yeah.
It's when you're like looking at old stuff and buying old stuff, and I don't mean from last year, I don't mean from 2 years ago, I don't mean from 3 years ago, when you're buying stuff that is well past the normal business life cycle for computers, let alone like enterprise life cycle. That's the only way that those hardware requirements are really going to cause you a problem. And it's just, if you're Microsoft, you don't care about that. Those people weren't making you any damn money on Windows sales anyway, because they're just another person getting the same use out of the same license fee that was paid like a decade ago by somebody different.
Yeah, and I think the way we're likely to see this go is Microsoft changing to more and more of a subscription model where you're just going to get the operating system changed out from under you without, like, it probably aren't going to be releases of Windows anymore so much as just every half a year there's a new update and it's the new version of Windows. And you either install the updates and get security updates or you don't.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an intuitive, programmable way to manage a private network. It's zero-trust network access that every organization can use, and with Tailscale's ACL policies, you can securely control access to devices and services with next-gen network access controls. Loads of the late-night Linux family hosts use Tailscale for all sorts, including controlling 3D printers, remoting into their relative systems for support, controlling Home Assistant, and sending ZFS snapshots to off-site backup locations. I got it set up in minutes, and you can too. So support the show and check out Tailscale for yourself. Go to tailscale.com/25A and try out Tailscale for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/25A. Novel attack against virtually all VPN apps neuters their entire purpose.
I kind of have to push back a little on the headline saying this is a novel attack. Like, maybe people are just kind of thinking of it now, but it's not even really like hacking. It's just using one of the built-in options to the DHCP protocol. When you have a laptop or another machine that gets an IP address automatically from the network, that protocol is DHCP, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. And there's a seldom used option that's been in there, from day one. It's option 121, and option 121 will basically allow the DHCP operator to configure static routes on any machines that are grabbing DHCP from it. So by doing that, you can put an attacker in the middle of any stream of traffic to any machine that's getting an IP address automatically from you. Now, that's not going to affect anybody who has configured their IP address statically. So one thing that you could do if you're feeling really paranoid about this, you're on a network where you don't trust the DHCP server, you can grab the IP address from DHCP. You can see what that IP configuration information is. Then you can go back and turn your interface back to static, not dynamic, and put in the same information the DHCP server just gave you. Now, that's not necessarily going to work forever because the DHCP server is going to try to hand that IP address out again whenever the lease expires. Might be an hour, might be a day, might be a week. But that will be good enough for right now to say, hey, I want to be able to get on this network and do something right now and not have to worry about option 121 screwing me over. Now, the other thing, obviously, that you can do is you can just look at your own route table and see if there's anything goofy in there. On most people's machines, there should not be that many different routes showing up in the route table. You have one route for your default gateway. If you've got a VPN up, you've got another route that goes through the VPN gateway out its interface. And that's usually just about it. If you see other things popping up that take priority over your VPN route, then you know, okay, I should be concerned about this, and I should be looking at ways to change this routing table back to what it should be.
Yeah, so looking in this more, I see how it's a bigger deal than I thought at first. And like, well, how is the attacker going to control the DHCP server inside my VPN? But it's actually not that. It's if they control, for example, the DHCP server or a DHCP server on the public Wi-Fi that you're on, when you get an IP address from the public Wi-Fi, it also says, oh, and to get to 10.10.10.0/24, also route it via the attacker's machine on the public Wi-Fi. And then when you connect to the VPN, that one address is now still routed not over the VPN, but has a more specific route to, say, over the public Wi-Fi. And so you could do this to purposely make sure any traffic the target user is trying to go over the VPN to their bank or something is going to, that one block of IPs will be routed to the attacker over the regular local network.
Yeah, to be clear, the DHCP server we're talking about very specifically is the DHCP server for the real network that you're connected to, which your VPN's virtual interface has to route its traffic out over. If that DHCP server is pushing malicious routes via option 121, well, then that's what you have to worry about. And there's not many ways to deal with this right now because, again, this is not actually a hack. It's not an attack. It's just using an option that's actually supposed to be there that people mostly just kind of forgot about. So Android, to my knowledge, is the only operating system right now that actually can be entirely immune to this. Even Linux and FreeBSD, if you use option 121, they'll take it and they'll alter the route table. So I don't know of a more reliable mitigation than literally disconnecting and turning off your DHCP client and just putting the information in statically. That's the only way I know of right now that you can be absolutely certain that option 121 isn't going to screw with your route table.
In FreeBSD, in the DHCP client configuration, you can set options to ignore. So you could say, if you see an option 121 from anybody, just don't follow it. Actually, Clara extended the configuration to be able to do that for multiple interfaces. We had a customer who needed two interfaces to both be DHCP, but to ignore the default route that came from one of them so that only one of them was for the internet, but the other one would still get its address auto-assigned. So there is a way to mitigate it there. And then from the other side of that, many switches have options to try to isolate rogue DHCP servers, where they will be like, okay, only this port is allowed to have answers to the DHCP requests, and stop what happens at many offices. Somebody accidentally plugs in a machine that had Windows's old like internet connection sharing or something configured, and then you end up with a DHCP server that's not the right DHCP server, giving out random IP addresses on your network. And then people, when their computer gets an address from that one because it's 1 millisecond closer on the network, then the internet stops working.
If you've got root on the switch, this is not usually something that you're going to be worried about in that particular environment. This is going to be something that you're worried about. For example, like if you're in a Starbucks, it doesn't matter what grade switch the Starbucks has in the back office where you can't see it, because your real concern is going to be somebody with a Wi-Fi pineapple that has just made a copycat SSID, and there is no mitigation there. If your system sees the access point that's actually the Wi-Fi pineapple in the bad guy's backpack saying Starbucks and chooses to join that one rather than the actual Starbucks AP, which also says SID Starbucks, well, that's it. You joined the wrong one and you're man in the middle.
It doesn't even have to be the wrong one, right? They could connect to the real Starbucks Wi-Fi and run a DHCP server, and if it answers faster than the Starbucks DHCP server, then that's the address your machine will take.
Well, yes, except that in that case, now I'm not trying to claim that Starbucks actually has like advanced mitigation measures, but at least in theory, like if you're just running a rogue DHCP on the actual Wi-Fi network, well, the actual Wi-Fi network itself can block that and may very well be configured to block that. But if you're just spinning up a copycat SSID with a Wi-Fi pineapple or just a random consumer router or whatever, then yeah, there's no mitigation there. The only thing you can hope at that point, like if you're the admin of the Starbucks or wherever, maybe you've got tools that automatically detect rogue access points popping up within range of your access points. And you can say, oh, wait, I see a rogue AP that's broadcasting my own SSID. It's time to find that person and throw them the hell out of my store. But as a customer or a user, nah, you're not going to know. You're not really going to have any way.
I can't be the only person who feels like option 121 is something that Palpatine would activate.
It does sound an awful lot like Order 66, doesn't it?
Let's do some feedback then. Sebastian writes, please consider saying renting instead of buying when talking about domains. I'm also trying to change my own dialogue about it because renting is a more correct description.
Absolutely fair point.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but especially since you have to pay for it again every year and the price keeps going up.
Yeah, I don't know why we call it buying and not renting, really.
Because renting doesn't sound very Tony. And when domains first became a thing and people first wanted to charge money for it, well, they wanted it to sound classy, didn't they?
I don't think it's going to catch on, though.
Yeah, I think it's a bit late, but it's true enough that it's worth trying to make an effort.
I think you could maybe make leasing stick.
Yeah.
Like you could maybe convince the corporate types to say lease, but they're never going to say rent.
That's true.
Well, Sebastian also asks, which landlord/steward of any TLD do you think would deserve your money? Background, on one side, you don't want to get blocked all over the internet, like when you talked about .tk, but you also don't want to pay too much for a domain, especially since it's only a rental. And of course, you want to vote with your wallet, so the money should only go to the organizations who deserve it.
I don't actually know of any organizations that I specifically feel like deserve my money that own TLDs. Google owns tons of them, and I absolutely don't feel like they deserve my money. In more practical terms, by far the most common TLD that I use is .net. .com is the premium choice, and when I can, I'll usually go for .com if it's available. The problem is that very frequently there is not a .com available for what you want. Not necessarily because there's a valid property on the web that's using it, but just because some damn speculator absolutely already got the .com. If you don't feel that the speculator deserves vastly more of your money than a registrar would charge, then, well, that's a no-go there. I don't really like any of the new kind of off-brand, for lack of a better word, TLDs, because while they mostly work everywhere these days, you never know when you're going to encounter some weird legacy system that doesn't think any TLD exists other than .com, .net, or .org.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. And I think the other problem is that underlying all of them is ICANN, and they're not great. So like, even if you're looking at like registrars, the registrars don't make that much money off the stupendous amount you pay for a domain. Most of that goes to ICANN. And the registrars don't actually own the TLD most of the time. And then, yeah, all the new ones is like somebody paid ICANN X $100,000 to own it. But it doesn't necessarily mean we should be giving them money either. Yeah, it's not great. And like the .ca, like the country code TLDs, sometimes those are run reasonably well. But if they're run well, they're usually not run for a profit. And so it's not about making money for them. It's about stewarding the cultureship of .ca or .dk for Denmark and a couple other ones that are reasonably well run.
Public services run not for profit. I don't know what you're on about, Alan.
Only exist in Denmark. So yeah, I can't recommend a TLD that is good.
No, and as you said, when it comes down to it, ICANN are a shower of bastards and they make a lot of money out of the whole thing. So you can't really win, can you?
So what we need for the EU to mandate a breakup. And so we all get to choose our root servers for DNS. And you can subscribe to this DNS or that DNS or the other DNS. And, you just hope that the site you want is on the DNS that you're using. It'll be great.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. What do you call an endpoint security product that works perfectly but makes users miserable? A failure. The old approach to endpoint security is to lock down employee devices and roll out changes through forced restarts, but it just doesn't work. IT is miserable because they've got a mountain of support tickets, employees start using personal devices to get their work done, and executives opt out the first time it makes them late for a meeting. You can't have a successful security implementation unless you work with end users. That's where Kolide comes in. Their user-first device trust solution notifies users as soon as it detects an issue on their device and teaches them how to solve it without needing help from IT. That way, untrusted devices are blocked from authenticating, but users don't stay blocked. Kolide is designed for companies with Okta, and it works on macOS, Windows, Linux, and mobile devices. So if you have Okta and you're looking for a device trust solution that respects your team, support the show and go to kolide.com/25A to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/25A. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Pablo writes, I recently enabled IPv6 on my router. I've noticed that some sites are now riddled with ads, where they used to have just a few prior to me enabling IPv6. Also, I'm now worried that websites will have a blast tracking me via my IPv6 address instead of relying on browser fingerprinting, which I can take measures to prevent. I've set Network Manager to use the highest privacy settings on my desktop, so my IPv6 address will vary, but the family's mobile phones in the house don't have this luxury. Although I'm fully aware that NAT is not security, and that my router does stateful packet inspection to prevent requests from the internet from reaching my systems behind, I feel more exposed with IPv6 than when I'm behind the usual IPv4 NAT, or even the ISP's hideous CG NAT. Should I just disable IPv6 on my router and go back to an IPv4 only 2010 home behind CG NAT? Should I implement a VLAN for things that are separate from the VLAN for phones and the VLAN for computers, and prevent things from even reaching the internet? What is the best approach to protect my home from prying eyes on the IPv6 internet?
So CGNAT makes this slightly more complicated, possibly, but like if you're comparing having one IPv4 address for every computer in your house once it goes through NAT versus IPv6 where you have a subnet and each computer's got its own address, there's not really any more tracking going on other than maybe they know which computer was in your place. But like you said, if you're using the IPv6 privacy settings where they're using different addresses to connect out so that it you don't always use the same IP address to connect to the same site, that can mitigate it somewhat. But I don't think it's fundamentally changing your privacy level one way or the other. For the thing about ads, I wonder did you have some kind of ad blocker and just when you had V6, the ads came over V6 and maybe weren't blocked as much. I've not really heard of websites having different ad profiles for V6 versus not. Although with Phoronix, maybe they just happened to ramp up the amount of ads around the time you made the switch.
Although Pablo didn't give us much details about how he's blocking ads, I suspect there's probably a pie-hole-like approach, and there may be more than one set of filters, and some of that may literally be black-holing IPv4 subnets. And it would not surprise me at all to have, much more evolved maps of IPv4 space, like what belongs to people who should not be allowed on your network, than, we've gotten yet with IPv6, because, well, not that many people are using IPv6, so it's a Wild West. I feel like Pablo would probably be the most comfortable, from what I'm hearing, if he were to actually set up IPv6 routing with NAT. That is a thing you can absolutely do. You can set up an IPv6 router, and you can use a private IPv6 subnet, and you can do NAT across it to a single IPv6 that goes out to the internet. It makes it a little easier for you to be certain that any central firewall rules that you set on that router are actually getting applied to all devices, because you know for a fact they can't get to the internet without going through you. I don't think that would fix, the ad problem. I think that's just something that you're going to basically have to play with, see if maybe a different ad blocking technique works better for you. Maybe try to get Firefox with uBlock Origin on your family's phones so that you can have proper ad blocking even on mobile. I find that the whole pie-hole and central ad blocking approach, I don't think it's that great. I think uBlock Origin is frankly the best option out there. And now that I can get that in a plugin on a first-class browser, Firefox, on my Android phones, I'm happy with that. Like, I'm done with needing things central.
All right, Grandad, using a browser for things. No one uses a browser for anything on a phone. They use apps, don't they?
Well, if you're using apps on the phone when you could be using a browser, you're just stuck with what you got. I mean, number one, the odds are fairly good that you're not somebody who's obsessing over ads because ads are ruining the experience. Because if you're doing all that, you're not like trying to do your own thing. You're a fish swimming downstream in the water. It's just part of the thing. Yeah, I don't like the ads, but there's ads, and I work around the ads, and that's what I do. Versus, folks like us and, like most of our listeners who we're talking to about this, who have a different response. They're like, there are ads and I don't like it. How do I make it so I like it again? But these are very different classes of human response,
How many of the times is the app not just the website, and the app is just a browser going to the website? It's just, it's an app. And at least if I'm using Firefox, I have some control over the browser.
Yeah, but if you're on an iPhone, then you're just completely screwed because it's not real Firefox. There's no uBlock Origin available.
Well, much like using apps instead of, going to the site in the browser, you just made the wrong decisions for your stated goals when you bought that iPhone. I'm sorry. I know how much of our audience is just right now. And
yes.
I love y'all. I'm not saying you're bad folks, but if this was your deal, then yeah, you made the wrong decision. You went to the super lockdown platform, and the entity that locked it down, they may do a lot of things that you do like, but they also do a lot of things that you don't. And you don't have a choice about it because you're on the super lockdown walled garden.
About 20% of our audience is cheering right now, and about 80% are going, "Rrr."
I don't know if those percents are. There's definitely a percent of them that just don't care.
I'd like to think another 20% or so own the iPhones and are just kind of shrugging and saying, it's a fair cop.
Yeah, probably. So have either of you done this? Are you using IPv6 at home?
I have some IPv6 at home, not as much as I probably could. It doesn't help that my new cable provider doesn't offer it. Doing the NAT there can be helpful, especially if you want to mix the traffic from a bunch of machines together. I actually took a slightly different approach. My one main PC goes out via NAT on a different address than every other machine in the house. And when I use my other machine, I notice I get a lot different ads from this based on the fact that the other half of the internet traffic in my house is for lady things. And I don't get any of those on my machine that doesn't use the same IP address, but I do get them on the machine that has all the other traffic.
I do think Pablo's correct that when the advertising entities can tell which machine is which, they will absolutely target the ads more closely and they will build more detailed profiles. Whether that has a direct, immediate, massive negative impact or not, probably not, but it's one notch tighter on the worm gear as they turn the vise. It's just further and further and learning more and more and getting more and more detail. And at some point, you just kind of have to be like, look, this is my house and I get to close the door and you can't just like press your nose up against the window and stare at me all night while I sleep. It's not okay.
To build on what Jim was saying and to answer the rest of Pablo's questions about VLANs, if you make a couple of VLANs, it's not going to make a big difference. But if you take Jim's idea where you're actually using IPv6 with NAT, except don't use one external IP address. Because it's V6, you usually have at least a reasonably sized subnet. You can have NAT configured to splay the outbound connections across a block of IP addresses, even with V4. And this way, what you could do is basically effectively get like you're getting from Network Manager with the IPv6 privacy, but for the phones and other devices that don't support it natively. So as it goes to the NAT, the router is going to just be like, oh, for Facebook, we're going to connect from this IP, and for YouTube, we're going to connect from this IP. And when you come back tomorrow, we'll use different IPs. And that can help disrupt some of the tracking that they're doing and just make it much harder to tell which device is which, because you're mixing all the traffic together and then spreading it all out across a range of addresses so that it's harder to tell which one's which.
Or you could just use a VPN service and, make it all barf out of the internet somewhere completely different. Change your endpoint every now and then. Really mess with them as much as you can.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joyrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.